The greeting is Mira settling in for the night, her voice unhurried. There was a time not so long ago by the measure of human history when the difference between a healthy year and a grieving one came down to a single choice made every morning before sunrise. Which water to drink, which source to trust. A family did not ask whether water might carry sickness. They asked which water on this particular morning was less likely to kill them. There was rarely a way to know for certain. The water looked the same either way. It smelled the same. It tasted, more often than not, exactly like safety. In a small farming village on a cold morning somewhere in the 14th century, a young mother named Elena stands at the edge of a well she has used her whole life. Her daughter, not yet 3 years old, is sick again the third time this season, and Elena has begun to wonder quietly, without saying it aloud to anyone, whether the well itself has turned against her family. Nothing about the well has changed that she can see. The stone rim is worn smooth in the same places it has always been worn smooth. The rope creaks the same way it has creaked for as long as she can remember. But 2 houses down, an old man died in the spring after a week of fever and a stomach that would not settle, and before him a boy from the miller's family and Eleanor has started counting these deaths the way a person counts something they are afraid to say out loud. She lowers the bucket. She waits for it to fill. She listens to the small, ordinary sound of rope against wood, and she tells herself the way people in every century have told themselves that the water will be fine this time, because it was fine yesterday and the day before that, and because there is no other water to drink. She carries the bucket inside. She boils nothing, because no one in her village yet understands that boiling would matter. She gives her daughter a cup, and she watches her drink it, and she feels for a moment something close to relief. This is the quiet, unbearable gamble that defined most of human existence for most of human history. Not war, not famine, not always. Something smaller and stranger and far more constant. A cup of water offered in love that might be carrying an enemy no one in the room could see, hear, or imagine. For almost the entire span of our species, this was simply how life worked. Long before anyone understood what a pathogen was, long before the word bacteria existed in any language human beings depended on water, they could not verify drawn from sources, they could not fully control, and they built entire civilizations on top of that uncertainty without ever naming it directly. It shaped where cities could grow and where they could not. It shaped how long a child was likely to live past their 5th birthday. It shaped which neighborhoods thrived and which ones quietly, mysteriously lost their children generation after generation for reasons no one at the time could explain. The story of clean water is not really a story about plumbing or engineering or public health boards, although all of those things eventually enter it. It is a story about trust, about the strange, necessary faith required to lift a cup to your mouth without knowing what is actually inside it. And it is a story about the slow, hard-won process by which a handful of people over thousands of years finally learn to see the invisible threat hiding in something as plain and as essential as a well. What is remarkable when you look closely at the historical record is how differently ancient peoples explained the danger they could sense but not identify. Some believed foul water carried bad spirits. Others believed illness rose from bad air near swamps and stagnant pools. An idea that would persist astonishingly well into the modern era, guiding public health decisions for centuries after it should have been abandoned. Physicians in ancient civilizations along the Nile and the Tigris developed careful, sometimes remarkably sophisticated methods of filtering and storing water, without ever fully understanding what they were filtering out. They were in a sense working blind, treating a threat they could taste in outcomes in sickness and death, but never see with their own eyes. It would take thousands of years and one particular investigation in one particular city before anyone finally connected the dots in a way that could not be ignored. Before we go further into that story, if this is the kind of history you come here for, the kind that sits with the ordinary overlooked parts of the past rather than only its wars and its kings, it helps enormously if you take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It costs nothing, and it tells me this is worth continuing to make. I would also love to know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and what drew you to a story about something as quiet as water. I read everyone, and it means more than you might think. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let this carry you. Elena's well was not unusual. It was in almost every meaningful sense ordinary. That is precisely what makes her story worth telling. For most of human history, this exact scene repeated itself with only small variations across nearly every village, town and city on every inhabited continent. A person stands at a water source. They cannot see what is inside it. They drink anyway because the alternative thirst is a certainty while contamination is only ever a possibility. Sometimes that gamble paid off for a lifetime. Sometimes it turned an entire household to grief within a single week. And across the long arc of human civilization, from the first river settlements to the crowded cities that would eventually grow so large and so thirsty that their old water sources could no longer keep pace, this same fragile bargain kept repeating generation after generation largely unnoticed until it grew impossible to ignore. That is where this story is going to travel. Not toward a single battle or a single ruler, but toward something quieter and in its own way more universal. Toward the rivers that first made civilization possible, and the same rivers that quietly turned against the people who depended on them. Toward the crowded, growing cities where water stopped being a simple gift of geography and became something far more dangerous. And eventually toward one street in one city where a single stubborn physician finally began to ask the question no one else had thought carefully enough to ask. But that is still ahead of us. For now it is enough to sit with Elena a little longer, at the edge of her well in the cold morning air, not yet knowing what we now know, not yet able to see what was waiting in the water all along. Across nearly every continent in nearly every era, before modern plumbing existed anywhere, a particular figure appears again and again in the archaeological and historical records so consistently that it becomes less an exception and more a rule of how human beings lived. She is usually young. She is usually a girl or a woman, and she is usually walking a container balanced on her head, her hip, or across her shoulders, moving along a path worn smooth by generations of feet that walked it before her own. Water does not travel on its own. Someone has to carry it, and for most of human history that labour fell overwhelmingly on women and children, a pattern so consistent across cultures with almost no contact with one another that anthropologists consider it one of the most universal divisions of labour in the human story. In villages across ancient Mesopotamia, along the terraced hillsides of early China, in settlements scattered through what is now sub-Saharan Africa, and in the scattered farmsteads of medieval Europe, the daily rhythm of life bent itself around the same basic task, performed at dawn and often again at dusk when the heat of the day had eased enough to make the walk bearable. The distances involved are difficult for a modern listener to fully absorb because most of us have never needed to measure our lives this way. In many regions, a source of water sat a mile or more from the settlement it served, sometimes considerably farther depending on rainfall terrain and how deeply a community had to dig before it struck anything worth drinking. A single trip might take the better part of an hour, and most households needed more than one trip simply to meet the basic demands of cooking, drinking, and washing. Multiply that by every day for every year for every generation and something remarkable becomes clear. An enormous portion of human labour across the whole of history was spent not building, not farming, not creating, but simply moving water from where it existed to where people needed it to be. This labour left its mark on the body as much as on the calendar. Archaeologists studying ancient skeletal remains have found telltale signs of chronic strain in the neck, spine and shoulders of women from cultures as distant from one another as the Eastern Mediterranean and the Andes, damage consistent with a lifetime of carrying heavy loads on the head or back. A full container of water could weigh 40 pounds or more carried over uneven ground often, while also managing a child a task or another burden entirely. It was not occasional labour. It was structural, woven into what it meant in a very literal sense to be a woman in most societies for most of recorded history. And this is where something quietly significant becomes visible in the historical record, something easy to miss if you are only looking at kings and wars, where water sat determined in the most direct and physical sense possible, where human beings could live at all. Settlements did not simply choose to grow near rivers, springs, and reliable wells out of convenience. They had almost no other option. Archaeological surveys across the ancient world show settlement patterns clustering tightly around dependable water sources, with population density falling off sharply as that distance increased. A civilization's borders, in a sense, were water's borders first and everything else farming trade routes. The placement of temples and palaces was negotiated around that first non-negotiable fact. It is here that one of history's quieter engineering triumphs deserves a moment of real attention because it rarely receives the credit it is due. Beginning sometime around the 8th century, before the Common Era engineers in ancient Persia developed a remarkable system for solving exactly this problem in one of the driest regions on Earth. They built long, gently sloping underground tunnels, sometimes stretching for many miles, that tapped into water trapped deep within hillsides and carried it entirely by gravity to villages and farmland far below, without a single pump, without a single moving part. These channels, known as qanats, allowed communities to flourish in landscapes that should have been nearly uninhabitable. And remarkably, some of these ancient systems are still in use today, nearly 3,000 years after they were first dug by hand in darkness, by workers whose names have not survived but whose engineering has. It is one of those details that tends to surprise people the first time that they hear it, that a solution this elegant, this durable, existed millennia before anyone had electricity or modern surveying tools. Elsewhere, other cultures solved the same fundamental problem in strikingly different ways. In the arid landscape surrounding the ancient city carved into the rock at Petra, engineers built an intricate network of channels, dams and cisterns designed to capture and store the region's scarce and unpredictable rainfall, turning a handful of unreliable storms each year into a water supply steady enough to sustain a major trading city in the middle of the desert. In parts of ancient China, communities dug wells deep enough that historians still debate exactly how early engineers achieved the depth some of these structures reached, given the tools available to them at the time. What unites all of these solutions, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time, is the same underlying truth. Water scarcity did not simply threaten human survival. It summoned some of the most sophisticated engineering the ancient world ever produced, born not from curiosity but from necessity. Scholars still debate precisely how many hours per week this water labour actually consumed across different realms and eras, since much of the surviving evidence comes from later ethnographic observation rather than direct testimony from the ancient world itself. What can be said with confidence is that the burden was substantial, that it fell disproportionately on those with the least power to refuse it, and that it shaped in ways historians are still working to fully map, patterns of education, labour, and daily life that persisted for thousands of years. A girl walking for water in the early morning was in many societies a girl who was not in school, not learning a trade, not resting. Her time, like the water itself, belonged to necessity long before it belonged to her. And beneath all of this all of this quiet engineering, all of this daily walking with a container balanced against the body, sat a danger that almost no one in the ancient or medieval world could see coming. The water that people worked so hard to reach and carry was not simply scarce. It was far more often than anyone realized at the time already working against them, carrying inside it the very thing that would end up costing more lives across human history than almost any war ever fought. The rivers and wells that made civilization possible in the first place were quietly and without warning capable of turning against the very people who depended on them most. The first cities on Earth did not choose their location by accident. They chose it because of a debt they could not avoid repaying. Along the banks of the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Indus, human beings settled where the land itself offered something no other landscape could: a renewable, dependable supply of fresh water and the fertile soil that came with it. These were not merely convenient places to live. They were, in the most literal sense, the only places where a civilization of any real size could exist at all. And the people who built the first great cities in human history understood this bargain intimately, even if they could not have explained it in the language we would use today. The Nile flooded once a year with a rhythm so consistent that ancient Egyptian society organized its entire calendar around it. Farmers along its banks depended on the flood, not despite its unpredictability, but because of its reliability, since the rising water deposited a fresh layer of fertile silt across the fields, each season replenishing soil that would otherwise have been exhausted within a generation. This single, dependable cycle allowed a civilization to flourish in the middle of one of the driest regions on the planet, sustaining cities, monuments, and a population far larger than the surrounding desert could otherwise have supported. Further east, the Tigris and the Euphrates offered a similar gift, though a far less predictable one, prone to sudden and violent flooding that could destroy an entire season's crops in a matter of days. The civilizations that rose between these two rivers, in the region historians call Mesopotamia, spent enormous effort building canals, levees, and irrigation channels specifically to tame this unpredictability engineering achievement so significant that some historians consider the management of water, rather than the invention of writing or the wheel, the true foundation of urban civilization itself. What almost none of these early societies understood, and what the archaeological and medical record has only pieced together gradually over the past century and a half, is that the very rivers responsible for their prosperity were quietly and continuously delivering something else alongside the water and the silt. Rivers that flow slowly through warm, densely populated regions, particularly rivers used simultaneously for drinking, bathing, irrigation, and the disposal of waste, become extraordinarily efficient environments for the transmission of parasites and pathogens. The same warmth and stillness that made the Nile ideal for agriculture also made it an ideal host for organisms that could move from person to person with devastating ease. One of these organisms leaves a trace so distinctive that scientists studying Egyptian mummies more than 3,000 years old have been able to identify it directly in preserved tissue. It is a parasitic disease still present in parts of the world today that enters the body through contact with contaminated water and slowly damages internal organs over years of infection. Ancient Egyptian medical texts describe symptoms consistent with this illness, with striking specificity, including a particular reference to blood appearing where it should not, a detail so consistently mentioned across surviving papyri that some historians believe the condition was common enough to be considered quietly almost a normal part of life along the river. Entire communities likely lived with this parasite present in their bodies for years, even decades, weakened, but functioning, their vitality slowly eroded by an enemy they had no way of identifying, much less naming. This is one of the genuinely startling details historians have only been able to confirm relatively recently, thanks to advances in the study of ancient tissue and preserved remains. For centuries, scholars studying ancient Egyptian society assumed that references to blood in medical texts pointed toward injury or violence. It took modern parasitology applied retroactively to 3,000-year-old evidence to reveal that the far more likely explanation was something the ancient Egyptians drank, bathed in, and depended on every single day of their lives. The rivers of Mesopotamia carried their own quiet dangers, though the historical evidence here is admittedly less complete, and scholars still debate exactly how widespread waterborne illness was in specific Mesopotamian cities during specific periods. Given how much of the surviving record consists of administrative and religious texts rather than direct medical observation, what does survive, however, points consistently toward a civilization deeply preoccupied with water purity in ways that suggest lived experience with its dangers. Sumerian and Babylonian texts include prayers and rituals specifically concerned with the cleanliness of water used for drinking and religious purposes, along with early legal codes that address penalties for contaminating shared water sources, a detail that only makes sense in a society that had already learned, likely through repeated and painful experience, that fouled water could bring illness and death to an entire community rather than a single household. Further east along the banks of the Indus, archaeologists have uncovered something that continues to genuinely surprise people encountering it for the first time, even those who consider themselves reasonably well-versed in ancient history. The cities of the Indus Valley civilization flourishing more than 4,000 years ago in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India contained sophisticated systems of covered drains, private household toilets connected to a citywide sewage network, and carefully engineered wells built with fired brick to prevent contamination from surrounding soil. In the city of Mohenjo-daro, nearly every substantial house appears to have had access to a private well or a shared water source within easy reach, along with drainage designed to carry wastewater away from living spaces and out toward larger channels beneath the streets. This level of civic water engineering would not be matched again in large parts of the world for well over 3,000 years, and it raises a genuinely difficult question that scholars have not fully resolved. If a Bronze Age civilization on the Indian subcontinent understood the basic principle that separating drinking water from waste mattered enough to build an entire urban infrastructure around it, why did so much of the ancient and medieval world afterwards seem to lose or ignore that understanding so completely? There is no single accepted answer to that question, and it remains one of the more quietly haunting puzzles in the history of public health. Some scholars point to the specific environmental pressures of the Indus region, suggesting that the civilization's engineering solutions emerged from particular local conditions that simply were not shared by other early societies. Others suggest that knowledge itself is fragile, that sophisticated technical understanding can be lost within a few generations if it is not actively maintained and transmitted, especially in societies without extensive written record keeping. What is certain is that the Indus Valley civilization's sanitation systems represent an extraordinary technical achievement that essentially vanished from historical memory for millennia, rediscovered only through careful excavation in the 20th century, long after the people who built it had already been forgotten by nearly everyone except the soil that eventually covered their cities. Across all three of these great river civilizations, a common and unsettling pattern emerges, one that historians studying ancient demography have worked to reconstruct through skeletal evidence. Ancient texts and comparative studies of pre-modern populations. Waterborne illness, largely invisible and rarely identified as a distinct cause in surviving records, likely accounted for a substantial portion of early childhood death across the ancient world, a burden so consistent and so normalized that it rarely appears as a dramatic event in surviving texts at all. It shows up instead in quieter ways in burial patterns weighted heavily toward infants and young children, in the sheer scale of child mortality implied by ancient population records, in the resigned, almost matter-of-fact tone many ancient texts use when referencing the death of the very young. This was not a civilization occasionally struck by tragedy, This was in a very real sense. The ordinary condition of life beside a river that gave everything and without any intention or malice quietly took a great deal back. And this is perhaps the deepest and most difficult truth sitting at the centre of these early river civilizations, one worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past. The very thing that made large-scale human civilization possible in the first place, dense settlement beside a shared reliable water source, was also by its very nature the thing that made large-scale disease transmission possible for the first time in human history. Before agriculture, before cities, human populations lived in smaller, more scattered groups, a pattern that limited how far and how quickly a waterborne illness could spread. The river that allowed Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley to grow into the first true civilizations on Earth was the same force that concentrated human beings closely enough and dependently enough for disease to travel between them with a speed and scale that simply had not existed before. Civilization and vulnerability, it turns out, were never separate developments. They arrived together, carried by the same water drawn from the same source, inseparable from the very beginning. What none of these ancient river societies could have known watching their children sicken along the same banks that fed their fields was that the pattern taking shape beside their wells and their canals would not stay confined to the ancient world. It would travel forward through every century that followed, changing shape, changing scale, waiting patiently in every crowded settlement still to come for the one thing it required most in order to grow far larger and far more devastating than anything the builders of Memphis or Ur or Mohenjo-Daro had ever imagined. Somewhere in the long transition between the ancient river civilizations and the crowded cities of later centuries, a quiet threshold gets crossed, one that no single generation ever recognized as it was happening. A city can grow only so large before the natural rhythms that once kept its water usable simply stop working. A river that easily absorbed and diluted the waste of a few thousand people cannot do the same for 100,000, and no one living through that slow accumulation experienced it as a single dramatic moment. They experienced it as their water tasting slightly worse than their grandparents remembered, as illness becoming a little more common, a little harder to explain away year after year, until an entire population was living inside a danger that had crept up on them so gradually it never once felt like an emergency. Rome offers one of history's strangest cautionary tales in this regard, precisely because the Roman world briefly solved this exact problem with a level of sophistication that would not be equalled again for well over 1,000 years. At the height of the empire, the city of Rome was supplied by a network of aqueducts stretching in total well over 250 miles, carrying water from distant springs and mountain sources into the city through a combination of underground channels, covered conduits, and the soaring stone arches that still stand remarkably in parts of the Italian countryside today. The scale of this system is difficult to overstate. Some estimates suggest that ancient Rome delivered more water per resident than many major cities offer their citizens today, distributed through public fountains, bathhouses, and for wealthier households, private plumbing connected directly to the network. Rome had in effect solved the exact problem that would go on to devastate cities across Europe for the next 15 centuries, and then almost unbelievably the solution was allowed to fall apart. When the western half of the Roman Empire collapsed, its aqueducts did not vanish overnight, but they stopped being maintained. An infrastructure of that complexity does not survive neglect for long. Channels cracked, arches crumbled. In some cases, invading forces deliberately severed aqueducts as a military tactic, understanding precisely how devastating it would be to cut a city off from the water it had built its entire way of life around. Within a few generations, the population of Rome itself, which had numbered close to 1 million people at its imperial peak, collapsed to a fraction of that size, and historians studying this decline still debate exactly how much of it can be attributed to the loss of reliable water infrastructure versus the many other political and economic disasters unfolding at the same time. What is not seriously disputed is that a city built to support enormous crowds through sophisticated engineering became, within a remarkably short span of time, a city that could no longer support anything close to its former population, in part because the water simply stopped arriving the way it once had. For much of the medieval period that followed across Europe, nothing resembling Rome's aqueduct network existed anywhere on the continent. Cities grew again slowly, and as they grew, they faced the same fundamental problem the Romans had already solved once, and then lost, except now with far less technical knowledge available to address it. Wells were dug close to houses out of simple necessity, since carrying water any real distance through crowded, muddy streets was exhausting and impractical. Cesspits used for household waste were dug nearby as well for exactly the same reason. And here is where an uncomfortable and largely invisible pattern took hold across medieval European towns, one that modern hydrogeology can explain with total clarity, but that almost no one at the time could have understood. Water does not stay where it is put. It moves through soil, seeping sideways and downward, and a cesspit and a well-positioned, even a modest distance apart, could and very often did share the same groundwater meaning. A household's drinking water and a household's waste were quite literally mingling beneath their feet without anyone ever seeing it happen. This was not a failure of intelligence or care. It was a failure of visibility. A well that looked clean, that produced water, that looked and tasted entirely normal, could be drawing steadily from a source contaminated by waste seeping in from yards away, and there was simply no way using anything available to a medieval household to know the difference. Illness that resulted felt random, unpredictable, sometimes attributed to bad luck, sometimes to the will of God, sometimes to that same old, persistent belief in foul air rising from low damp places. Why would anyone suspect the well when the well had served the family faithfully for years, when the water looked exactly the way water was supposed to look? Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in a city few Europeans of the period had any awareness of at all, an entirely different civilization was solving this exact problem with startling elegance. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, built on an island in the middle of a lake in the valley that is now Mexico City, faced water challenges unlike almost anywhere else in the ancient or medieval world. Surrounded on all sides by the lake water, too brackish and too contaminated by the city's own waste to drink safely. Rather than accept this as an unsolvable limitation, Aztec engineers constructed an aqueduct system stretching several miles from freshwater springs on the mainland, carrying clean water directly into the heart of the city through a dual-channel design that allowed one line to be cleaned and maintained, while the other remained in continuous use, an approach to redundancy and public infrastructure that many modern water systems still strive to achieve. The city also maintained an extensive system of canals for transportation and waste removal, kept carefully separate from its drinking water supply, along with public latrines whose contents were collected and used deliberately as agricultural fertilizer rather than allowed to seep back into the water table. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 16th century, several of them recorded genuine astonishment at the scale, cleanliness and organization of a city that in terms of sheer population likely rivaled or exceeded most European capitals of the same era, sustained in large part by water engineering considerably more advanced than anything most of those same soldiers would have encountered at home. It's worth pausing on that fact for a moment, because it complicates any simple story about steady linear progress in human history. Engineering sophistication was never distributed evenly across the world, and it was never permanent once achieved. Rome had it and lost it. Tenochtitlan had it and lost it as well, though through conquest and deliberate destruction rather than gradual decay, when Spanish forces dismantled much of the city's infrastructure during and after the siege that ended Aztec independence. Knowledge this sophisticated, it turns out, has always been fragile, dependent on political stability, continued investment, and a kind of collective will that no civilization, however advanced, could guarantee would last forever. Back in Europe, as medieval towns slowly grew into early modern cities, the underlying problem never disappeared. It simply intensified quietly decade after decade as more people crowded into the same limited urban space, drawing water from the same finite and increasingly compromised sources. Historians studying population records from cities across this period note a pattern that repeats with striking consistency. Infant and child mortality remained stubbornly, brutally high, not primarily because of famine or violence, though both certainly played their part, but because of a steady undercurrent of illness that struck hardest at the very young, the very old, and the already weakened. An undercurrent that contemporary observers rarely connected explicitly to water, since the connection itself had not yet been discovered by anyone anywhere in a way the wider medical world was prepared to accept. Scholars still debate exactly how much of pre-modern mortality can be attributed specifically to waterborne illness, as opposed to the many other overlapping causes of death, common to the period since surviving records rarely distinguish causes of death with anything approaching modern medical precision. What the evidence does suggest consistently and across an enormous range of regions and centuries is that wherever human density outpaced a city's ability to keep drinking water, separate from human waste, sickness followed close behind. Arriving not as a single dramatic catastrophe, but as a slow-grinding, generational toll that families simply learn to live with and to grieve and to expect. By the time Europe's cities entered the early industrial era, growing faster and denser than almost any urban centres in human history, had grown before this old quiet danger was no longer merely simmering beneath the surface of daily life. It was about to meet a scale of crowding and a speed of growth that would push it past a threshold no city had ever crossed before in a way that no one living through the change could yet have predicted. The number that historians and demographers keep returning to when they try to summarize the true cost of this danger across recorded history is difficult to hold in the mind for very long, because it resists the kind of clean dramatic framing we usually associate with historical catastrophe. There was no single battle, no single famine, no single collapse responsible for it. Instead, across nearly every century before the modern era in nearly every part of the world, something close to a third of all children born did not survive to see their 5th birthday, and a substantial share of that loss, though never recorded with anything like modern precision, traces back to the water those children drank in their earliest, most vulnerable months of life. It helps to understand what was actually happening inside a body exposed to contaminated water, not in clinical detail, but simply enough to understand why this particular danger was so difficult for people in the past to identify and defend against. Water carrying certain bacteria, particularly the organisms responsible for what we now call typhoid and dysentery, does not announce itself. A person can drink from a source contaminated with these organisms and feel entirely normal for hours, sometimes for a full day or more before any symptom appears. By the time illness does arrive, it can be severe, prolonged, and particularly in small children and infants, devastating to a body that has very little reserve strength to draw on. This delay between exposure and illness is precisely what made the danger so difficult to trace. A family might drink from the same well every day for months without incident, then fall ill, only after the contamination reached a certain threshold, or after a particular rainfall washed waste into the water table, and by then connecting the illness back to that specific ordinary act of drinking water felt almost impossible. How could something a family had done safely 1,000 times before suddenly become the thing that took a child's life? Infants faced a particular and cruel vulnerability within this larger pattern, one that historians of childhood and public health have only fully appreciated in recent decades. A breastfed infant nursed directly by a healthy mother received nourishment that was in effect naturally protected from most waterborne contamination, since breast milk does not carry the same pathogens present in a community's water supply. But the moment an infant was weaned, whether at a few months old or, in many pre-modern societies, considerably later, that same child was suddenly exposed to whatever the surrounding water supply contained, often mixed directly into the porridges, gruels, and diluted foods used to transition infants towards solid food. Demographic historians studying parish records across early modern Europe have identified a distinct measurable spike in infant mortality clustered around the age of weaning in many communities, a pattern so consistent that some researchers now consider it one of the more reliable indirect indicators of local water quality available in the historical record, precisely because it shows up not as a dramatic outbreak but as a quiet recurring seasonal rhythm of loss. There is one particular affliction from this era that deserves to be understood not only for the suffering it caused but for the strange, almost mythic place it holds in the history of medicine, and it concerns a parasite. Most modern listeners have likely never heard named aloud. Dracunculiasis, more commonly known across history as Guinea. Worm disease is transmitted when a person drinks stagnant water containing tiny water fleas infected with parasitic larvae. Once inside the body, the larvae mature slowly over the better part of a year, growing almost unbelievably into a worm that can reach 2 or 3 feet in length, before eventually working its way toward the skin, typically near the foot or lower leg, where it creates a painful blister that eventually ruptures, allowing the worm to begin slowly emerging from the body over a period of days or even weeks. This affliction appears in some of the oldest medical writing that survives from the ancient world. Egyptian medical papyri dating back more than 3,000 years describe treatment methods for exactly this condition, and remarkably the traditional method of treatment, carefully winding the emerging worm around a small stick, a little at a time over many days to slowly draw it fully out of the body without breaking it. A practice that had to be done with enormous patience, since a broken worm could cause severe infection remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years afterward, practiced in villages across Africa and Asia well into the modern era. Some medical historians have proposed, though this remains genuinely debated, rather than settled, that this ancient treatment may be the true origin of one of medicine's most enduring symbols, the image of a serpent wound around a staff still used today on ambulances, pharmacies, and medical institutions around the world, a quiet thread connecting a modern hospital logo back to a village well and a patient's slow, careful ordeal 3,000 years ago. Whether that theory is fully accurate or not, what is beyond dispute is that guinea worm disease, born entirely from contaminated standing water, shaped the daily suffering of countless communities across an extraordinary span of human history largely uninterrupted, until coordinated public health efforts finally began pushing it toward near eradication only within the last several decades. Cholera and typhoid are the two illnesses that would eventually force the modern world to finally confront the true danger hiding in its water, operated through a mechanism that is in its own way almost elegantly cruel. Both diseases cause the body to lose fluid rapidly through vomiting and severe diarrhea, and it is this fluid loss itself, dehydration rather than the bacteria directly, that most often proves fatal, particularly in small children whose bodies hold so little reserve to begin with. A child who seemed only mildly unwell in the morning could, in a severe case, be gone before the following sunrise. A progression so swift and so unlike other illnesses familiar to pre-modern medicine that many communities genuinely believed themselves to be facing something closer to a curse or a punishment than an ordinary disease. Physicians of the period, working entirely without any understanding of bacteria, could offer little beyond comfort in their treatments, which often included further restricting fluids at exactly the moment a dehydrated body needed them, most likely made outcomes worse rather than better. An uncomfortable irony that medical historians now regard as one of the clearer examples of how a wrong theory sincerely and carefully applied can cause genuine harm. The evidence for exactly how many lives these illnesses claimed across the centuries before reliable record-keeping remains and likely always will remain incomplete. Parish registers, where they survive at all, often record only that a death occurred, not its cause, and rural communities in particular left behind fragmentary records at best, meaning historians are forced to reconstruct the true scale of this loss through inference comparison and careful demographic modelling rather than direct counting. What those reconstructions suggest consistently across region after region and century after century is a toll almost too large to comfortably absorb, likely exceeding across the full span of human history the combined losses of every war ever fought, not through any single dramatic event, but through this same quiet repeating pattern: a cup of water, a family, a child, a loss recorded. If it was recorded at all, without any explanation beyond the plain fact that a fever came and did not pass. And yet threaded through even this heaviest part of the story, there is something worth holding on to, a kind of resilience that rarely receives its due. Families living inside this danger were not passive. Across many cultures, informal, hard-won folk knowledge slowly accumulated about which water sources tended to be safer than others, which wells to avoid after heavy rain, which springs a community trusted above all others, even without understanding precisely why. Grandmothers in villages across every inhabited continent passed down small practical rules: boil the water if illness has been going around, avoid the well nearest the tannery draw, water only from the moving stream rather than the still pond. Rules built not on scientific understanding, but on generations of careful, painful observation, a kind of inherited wisdom that, even without a name for the danger it addressed, quietly saved lives long before anyone could explain exactly why it worked. It would take one particular convergence of circumstance, one crowded growing city and one especially severe outbreak, to finally force this scattered instinctive folk wisdom into something closer to genuine scientific understanding. That convergence was still some distance ahead in this story, but the pieces required to reach it, a city large enough to concentrate the danger and outbreak, severe enough to demand real investigation, and eventually one particular physician stubborn enough to ask the question everyone else had somehow managed to avoid asking, were already quietly gathering, waiting for the specific set of conditions that would finally bring them together. In the final days of August, in the year 1854, on a narrow, crowded street in the heart of London called Broad Street in a neighbourhood known as Soho, a 5-month-old infant named Frances Lewis begins to suffer from severe diarrhoea. Her mother, living in a cramped set of rooms above a busy shop, does what any mother in her position would do. She cleans the soiled linen as best she can, and she disposes of the wastewater the way nearly every household on the street disposes of its wastewater, into a cesspool sitting directly beneath the house, a common arrangement across much of London. At the time where waste was allowed to seep slowly into the ground rather than being carried away through any organised system, no one in that household or on that street or anywhere in the city had any reason to suspect that this small, ordinary act of disposal was about to become one of the most consequential moments in the entire history of medicine. Soho in 1854 was one of the most densely packed neighbourhoods in the largest city on earth, home to somewhere in the range of 30,000 people crowded into a space of barely a few streets, many of them living in conditions that had changed little in generations. Broad Street itself was lined with shops, workshops, taverns, and tightly packed residential buildings stacked several stories high, and at the centre of daily life for this entire neighbourhood sat a public water pump positioned at the corner of Broad Street and Cambridge Street, drawing water from a well sunk into the ground below. This pump was by every account that survives genuinely popular. Its water tasted noticeably better than water from several nearby pumps, cool and clear in a way that made it a preferred source not only for residents living immediately nearby, but for people from surrounding streets who would walk some distance specifically to fill their containers there, along with the local businesses that used its water in food preparation, brewing and daily trade. It is worth sitting with that fact for a moment because it explains everything that follows. The very quality that made this particular pump beloved its clean, pleasant taste gave residents of Soho no reason whatsoever to suspect it of anything. Within days of the Lewis infant's illness, something began happening on Broad Street that had no precedent in the memory of anyone living there. People began falling ill with a speed and a severity that felt to those experiencing it almost supernatural. A person who felt entirely healthy in the morning could be dead by nightfall, their body ravaged by relentless vomiting and diarrhea that left them dangerously, catastrophically dehydrated within hours rather than days. Reports from the time describe entire families struck down within the same short window, describe people collapsing in the street itself, describe a fear settling over the neighbourhood that had no obvious cause, and at first no obvious pattern. Within the first 3 days of the outbreak, more than 100 people in the immediate vicinity of Broad Street had died a death toll, so concentrated and so rapid that surviving residents began fleeing the neighbourhood entirely, abandoning homes and businesses in a wave of evacuation that emptied entire blocks within a matter of days. By the time the worst of the outbreak had passed, roughly 616 people had died, the overwhelming majority of them within a strikingly small radius of that one particular pump, though almost no one living through it yet understood why the deaths clustered the way they did. What makes this specific outbreak so significant beyond even its staggering speed and concentration is a detail that would only reveal its full importance once someone finally thought to examine it closely, and it involves an institution most people would never think to associate with survival during a public health crisis. A large brewery, the Lion Brewery, stood on Broad Street itself, employing several dozen workers who lived and laboured within the very heart of the outbreak zone. And yet, remarkably, not a single employee of that brewery died during the entire episode. For years, this detail would sit quietly in the historical record as little more than a curiosity until it was finally understood for what it actually revealed. Brewery workers, as part of their daily allowance, drank beer rather than water throughout their working hours, a practice common in breweries of the period. The brewing process itself, involving boiling water at a high temperature as a fundamental step in beer production, had unknowingly been killing the very organism responsible for the outbreak before it ever reached a single worker's mouth. Men who spent their days literally standing beside the deadliest well in London survived entirely unharmed, not through any medical intervention or protective instinct, but because the simple industrial process required to make their daily beer had, without anyone intending it, sterilised their water for them. There is another detail from this same outbreak that deserves its own quiet moment of attention because it runs in precisely the opposite direction, and it concerns a small group of residents who should by every reasonable expectation have been among the first to fall ill, yet were not. A workhouse standing very close to the epicentre of the outbreak housed several hundred residents, and only a small handful among them contracted the illness. Investigation afterward revealed that this particular workhouse maintained its own private well entirely separate from the public pump on Broad Street, and drew its water from that internal source, rather than from the well everyone else in the neighbourhood depended on. Two institutions standing almost within sight of one another, experiencing entirely different fates for reasons that had nothing to do with luck, faith, or the will of any higher power, and everything to do with where, specifically, their water happened to come from. It would be easy looking back with the benefit of everything we now understand about bacteria and contamination to feel a kind of frustration on behalf of the residents of Soho to wonder why no one connected these obvious patterns sooner. But it is worth remembering gently that almost nobody living through this outbreak had any conceptual framework that would have allowed them to draw these conclusions. The dominant medical theory of the era held, with near universal confidence among physicians, that disease of this kind was carried not through water at all but through foul air, rising from decaying matter, a theory so deeply entrenched that it shaped nearly every public health decision made in London for decades before and after this particular summer. Official investigators sent to Soho in the immediate aftermath of the outbreak dutifully catalogued the smells of the neighbourhood, its overcrowded courtyards, its poor drainage, its general atmosphere of decay, entirely convinced that the answer to what had happened lay somewhere in the quality of the air itself. Why would anyone suspect a source of water so trusted, so clean, tasting so central to daily life that residents walked considerable distances specifically to drink from it, when every authority of the time pointed with such confidence toward an entirely different explanation? Scholars still debate certain particulars of exactly how the contamination initially reached the well beneath the Broad Street pump, since the precise construction of the cesspool serving the Lewis household, and the exact condition of the brickwork separating it from the nearby well, were never documented with the kind of precision a modern investigation would demand. What later analysis made clear, however, is that the well itself had been dug uncomfortably close to that cesspool, separated by only a few feet of aging brick and soil conditions that made seepage not merely possible, but in hindsight almost inevitable. The very density that made Soho such a vibrant, bustling part of London, its buildings pressed close together, its infrastructure built and rebuilt over generations without any centralised plan, had quietly created exactly the conditions this particular danger needed most. By the time the worst of the dying had slowed, Broad Street stood largely empty, its usual crowds replaced by a strange, unsettling quiet, its residents scattered across the city or gone entirely, its shops shuttered, its famous pump still standing at the corner, exactly as it always had, giving no outward sign whatsoever of what it had done. Most of London and most of the medical establishment along with it would move on from this outbreak the way they had moved on from countless outbreaks before cataloguing it as another tragic, unexplained visitation of a disease that seemed to arrive and depart according to its own inscrutable logic. But not everyone was prepared to let the question rest there. Living not far from Broad Street itself was a physician with a long-standing, largely private skepticism toward the prevailing theories of his profession. A man who had already spent years quietly questioning whether disease of this kind truly travelled through air at all, and who now found himself standing at the edge of an outbreak concentrated with an intensity that seemed to his particular and unusually careful eye to be telling a very different story than the one everyone else around him had already decided to believe. The physician's name was John Snow, and by the time cholera returned to swallow Broad Street whole in the late summer of 1854, he was already in the eyes of much of his profession. Something of an outsider respected for his technical skill, but regarded with a certain polite skepticism whenever the conversation turned to the true cause of cholera. Snow had built his early reputation as one of the pioneering figures in the emerging field of anaesthesia, having personally administered chloroform to Queen Victoria during the birth of 2 of her children, a level of trust and precision that placed him firmly among the more capable physicians of his era. And yet for nearly a decade before the Broad Street outbreak, Snow had been quietly, methodically building a case that ran directly against the medical consensus of his time, arguing in papers that most of his colleagues either dismissed or simply ignored, that cholera was not carried through foul air at all but through water, contaminated by the waste of those already infected. This was in 1854 a genuinely radical position, and it is worth understanding exactly how radical, because it helps explain why so few people took Snow seriously at first. The miasma theory. The belief that disease arose from noxious air produced by decaying organic matter was not some fringe idea confined to uneducated corners of society. It was the dominant scientific framework accepted by the vast majority of Britain's most respected physicians, its public health officials, and its scientific institutions. When Snow had first proposed his waterborne theory several years earlier following an outbreak in a different part of London, his ideas were met largely with polite indifference, occasionally with outright dismissal from figures considerably more prominent and more influential than himself. He had by 1854 spent years essentially alone in his conviction, watching outbreak after outbreak get explained away through air quality and general filths, without a single piece of evidence conclusive enough to force his colleagues to reconsider. What made Broad Street different? What finally gave Snow the opportunity he had been waiting for without quite knowing it was the outbreak's extraordinary and highly localized intensity. A disease that killed with this much speed and concentrated with this much precision within a handful of streets was, to Snow's particular way of thinking, exactly the kind of event capable of exposing a pattern that a slower, more diffuse outbreak might have obscured. Within days of the outbreak beginning, Snow began walking the streets of Soho himself, a decision that placed him in direct sustained proximity to an active and lethal epidemic at a time when many physicians of standing would have kept their distance. He went door to door and approached almost nobody in his profession employed at the time, asking grieving families a set of remarkably specific and to many of them oddly narrow questions. Not questions about air or filth or moral character, the kinds of questions officials investigating the outbreak had already been asking. He wanted to know where each household drew its water. The picture that slowly emerged from these interviews was striking in its consistency. Household after household that had suffered deaths clustered tightly around a single point of common behaviour. Every one of them had drawn their drinking water from the public pump at the corner of Broad Street and Cambridge Street. Snow began recording each death, not merely as a name on a list, but as a specific location marking each fatal case directly onto a map of the neighbourhood, a method that seems almost obvious in hindsight, but represented at the time a genuinely novel approach to understanding the shape of an epidemic. As the marks accumulated on his map, a pattern began to emerge that no verbal description could have conveyed with the same immediate visual force. The deaths did not scatter randomly across Soho. They clustered tightly and unmistakably around that single pump, thinning out steadily the further one moved away from it, exactly the pattern one would expect if the water itself, rather than the surrounding air, carried the danger. Snow's investigation uncovered two details in particular that he would go on to treat as central pieces of evidence, and both concerned households that by the ordinary logic of miasma theory should have suffered terribly, yet did not. He had already begun to notice in the days following the outbreak the case of the nearby workhouse with its own private well and the brewery whose workers drank beer rather than water throughout their shifts, cases that fit his theory with a precision that felt to him almost too clean to be coincidence. But it was a third case more intimate and in some ways more haunting than either of these that Snow would return to again and again in his subsequent writing. He learned of a woman, a widow, who had once lived on Broad Street itself, but had since moved to a different part of London, well beyond the immediate outbreak zone. She had, however, developed such a fondness for the taste of the Broad Street pump's water during her years living nearby that she arranged to have it carried to her regularly in bottles, a small sentimental habit maintained long after she had physically left the neighbourhood behind. She died of cholera during the very same outbreak despite living nowhere near Soho, connected to the epidemic by nothing more than her continued loyalty to a particular pump's water. Her case, more than almost any other single piece of evidence Snow gathered, demonstrated with unsettling clarity that proximity to bad air could not explain what was happening, since she had breathed none of Soho's air in years. Only the water connected her to the dead. Armed with this accumulating body of evidence, Snow approached the local parish authorities and made a request that in retrospect seems almost startlingly simple, though it required considerable persuasion at the time given how little most officials trusted his underlying theory. He asked them to remove the handle from the Broad Street pump, physically disabling it so that no one could draw water from it while the investigation continued. The authorities, more out of a willingness to try anything than any genuine conviction in Snow's waterborne theory, agreed. The pump handle was removed in early September of 1854. It would be satisfying in the way a story likes to resolve itself to say that removing the handle immediately ended the outbreak, and this claim has indeed circulated widely in the years since, becoming something close to popular legend. The historical reality is more complicated and more honest, and Snow himself acknowledged as much in his own later writing. By the time the pump handle was removed, the outbreak had already been declining for several days, likely because the neighbourhood's population had already fled in such large numbers that fewer people remained to become infected, and because, as later understanding would confirm, the well's contamination may have been naturally diminishing as the source of pollution was exhausted. Snow never claimed that removing the handle single-handedly stopped the epidemic, and scholars examining this history closely still debate exactly how much credit the intervention itself deserves relative to the outbreak's already declining natural course. What Snow did claim, and what his careful mapping and door-to-door investigation genuinely demonstrated beyond reasonable dispute, was the underlying pattern itself that this outbreak, and by strong implication cholera outbreaks, generally trace back to contaminated water rather than contaminated air. Snow published his findings, including his now famous map marking each death in relation to the pump, expecting reasonably enough given the strength of his evidence that the medical establishment would finally take his waterborne theory seriously. What actually happened reveals something quietly important about how difficult it can be for even overwhelming evidence to overturn an idea that has become deeply embedded in professional consensus. The prevailing medical and scientific authorities of the day, including a formal government inquiry into the outbreak, largely rejected or minimized Snow's conclusions, continuing, instead, to favor explanations rooted in miasma theory for years afterward. Snow would die in 1858, only 4 years after his Broad Street investigation, without ever receiving anything close to the widespread professional recognition his work would eventually earn. It was not until decades later, following further outbreaks, further investigations, and eventually the direct microscopic identification of the bacterium responsible for cholera by a different researcher working in a different country, that Snow's waterborne theory was finally fully vindicated, and his careful, patient door-to-door investigation of one small London neighbourhood came to be recognised as one of the foundational moments in the entire history of epidemiology, the study of how disease spreads through populations. There is a particular kind of quiet tragedy in that timeline worth sitting with for a moment. Snow died believing correctly in an idea that most of his professional peers still considered unproven, even mistaken. He did not live to see his map become one of the most celebrated documents in the history of medicine, did not live to see his methodology tracing disease back to its physical source through careful, systematic observation become a standard practice adopted by public health investigators around the world. He simply did the careful work in the middle of a genuine crisis, guided by a conviction he could not yet fully prove, and trusted that the pattern he had found was real, even when almost no one around him was prepared to believe it. What Snow's investigation ultimately represents beyond the specific and remarkable story of one outbreak on one London street is a turning point in how human beings understood their own vulnerability to something they still could not see. For the entire span of history covered so far in this story, going back to the earliest river civilizations, danger had travelled through water, invisibly, unaccountably blamed variously on curses, on foul air, on the will of distant gods, because no one possessed a framework capable of revealing its true and rather ordinary physical cause. Snow's map did not identify the specific organism responsible. That discovery, the actual bacterium itself visible under a microscope, was still years away, and would arrive through the work of other researchers working independently in continental Europe. But Snow's investigation proved something equally important, that the danger could be traced, mapped, and understood through careful observation, that it followed rules rather than striking at random, and that human beings, for the first time in this long and quiet history, finally possessed a method capable of hunting it down. What Snow's work could not yet fully answer, and what would occupy the next generation of researchers working across several different countries, was the deeper question of exactly what was living inside that contaminated water, invisible to the naked eye, capable of travelling from a single infant's illness to hundreds of deaths within the span of a few short days. That answer was still being assembled piece by careful piece in laboratories most of Soho's grieving families would never hear of, by researchers whose own path toward understanding would prove just as difficult and in some cases just as quietly overlooked as Snow's had been. For nearly 2,500 years before John Snow ever set foot on Broad Street, the belief that disease travelled through bad air had already been quietly shaping human thought, and understanding just how old and how deeply rooted this idea was helps explain why even overwhelming evidence struggled to dislodge it in the space of a single generation. The idea traces back at least as far as ancient Greek medicine, where physicians working in the tradition associated with Hippocrates observed correctly enough on the surface that illness tended to cluster around swamps, stagnant pools, and low-lying, poorly ventilated places. They called the corrupted air rising from such places miasma, a word that would go on to shape medical thinking across an astonishing span of human history, surviving the fall of Rome, surviving the Middle Ages, surviving the Renaissance, and arriving fully intact into the 19th century, still treated by most educated physicians as settled scientific fact. There was, it must be said, a genuine kernel of observable truth buried inside the theory, which is precisely what allowed it to survive for so long. Swampy, poorly drained areas really were more dangerous, not because of their air as it turned out, but because they were exactly the kind of stagnant, contaminated environment where mosquitoes bred and water sat still long enough to become dangerous. The theory was, in a strange sense, correctly noticing a real pattern, while completely misunderstanding its cause close enough to observable reality to feel convincing for well over 2,000 years. By the middle of the 19th century, miasma theory had become something considerably more than a folk belief. It had become institutional, embedded in the thinking of Britain's most respected medical authorities, and, crucially, in the policies of its emerging public health movement. Edwin Chadwick, one of the most influential social reformers of the era, built much of his landmark 1842 report on the sanitary conditions of Britain's working population almost entirely around miasma theory, arguing forcefully that filth itself, through the foul air it produced, was the direct cause of disease among the urban poor. Chadwick was not a fool, and this is worth pausing on because it complicates any simple story about ignorance versus knowledge. He was by most measures one of the sharpest social reformers of his generation, deeply committed to improving the lives of Britain's poorest citizens, and his advocacy helped drive genuinely significant improvements in urban sanitation. Better drainage, cleaner streets, improved waste removal. He simply believed with total sincerity and the backing of nearly the entire medical establishment of his time that he was fighting disease by clearing the air when he was in fact, without ever realizing it, also removing much of the contaminated waste that had been seeping into the water supply all along. This is perhaps the strangest and most quietly ironic thread running through this entire chapter of history. Miasma theory was in its specific mechanism wrong, and yet many of the public health reforms it inspired, better drainage, cleaner streets, improved waste disposal, ended up reducing waterborne illness anyway, simply because cleaning up visible filth and foul-smelling waste often meant, as an unintended side effect, reducing the contamination reaching nearby wells and water sources. Progress, it turns out, does not always require a correct theory. Sometimes a wrong idea pursued with enough sincerity and enough genuine care for human welfare can still stumble its way toward real and measurable improvement, even while missing the true mechanism entirely. Florence Nightingale offers perhaps the most poignant example of this strange dynamic, and her story tends to surprise people encountering it for the first time, given how thoroughly her legacy has been simplified in popular memory. Nightingale, working to reform military hospital conditions following her experience during the Crimean War, became one of the most passionate and influential advocates for improved sanitation, fresh air, and cleanliness in the history of nursing, and her reforms are widely and rightly credited with dramatically reducing mortality among hospitalized soldiers. What is less commonly known is that Nightingale herself remained throughout most of her career a committed believer in miasma theory, explicitly skeptical of the emerging germ theory of disease, even as evidence in its favor continued to accumulate during her lifetime. She insisted on fresh air circulation and rigorous cleanliness in hospital wards, not because she believed in invisible microorganisms, but because she believed foul, stagnant air itself directly caused and spread infection. Her methods worked dramatically and measurably, largely because the ventilation, cleanliness, and improved sanitation she demanded also happened to reduce the transmission of the actual pathogens she did not yet believe existed. It raises a question worth sitting with quietly for a moment. How many other reformers across history, we might wonder unknowingly, did the right thing for reasons that were strictly speaking incorrect? The theory that would eventually displace miasma entirely did not emerge in a single dramatic breakthrough, but through a slow, scattered accumulation of evidence across several countries advanced by researchers who, much like Snow himself, often struggled for years to be taken seriously. And here, the historical record contains a detail that many people find genuinely startling once they learn it. An Italian anatomist named Filippo Pacini had actually identified the specific bacterium responsible for cholera under a microscope in 1854, the very same year as the Broad Street outbreak, examining tissue samples from cholera victims and correctly identifying the comma-shaped organism now known as Vibrio cholerae. Pacini published his findings clearly and in detail, and almost nobody in the wider medical community paid any meaningful attention to them at all. His work sat largely ignored for nearly 3 decades, overshadowed by the dominance of miasma theory, and quite possibly by Pacini's relatively modest standing within the broader scientific establishment of his time. It would not be until 1883 when the German physician and researcher Robert Koch identified the same bacterium independently during an outbreak investigation in Egypt that the scientific world finally definitively accepted what Pacini had already demonstrated. Correctly, 29 years earlier, Koch received widespread credit and recognition for a discovery that in the strictest historical sense had already been made by someone else in a paper that had simply gone unread by the people positioned to act on it. Historians of science still debate exactly why Pacini's discovery was so thoroughly overlooked for so long, since the surviving evidence does not point to any single clear explanation. Some point to the relative obscurity of the journal in which he published. Others suggest that the scientific community of the 1850s simply was not yet prepared conceptually to accept that something as small as a bacterium invisible without specialized equipment few researchers possessed could be responsible for killing hundreds of people within a matter of days. Whatever the precise cause, Pacini's story stands as a quiet, sobering reminder that being correct, even correct with clear and careful evidence in hand, has never been enough on its own to change the world. An idea also needs the right audience at the right moment prepared to actually listen. The broader shift away from miasma theory, once it finally began accelerating in the 1860s, 70s and 80s, did not happen because of any single discovery, but through a growing body of independent work across multiple countries, including the foundational research of Louis Pasteur in France, whose experiments demonstrating that microorganisms cause fermentation and spoilage laid essential groundwork for the wider acceptance of germ theory across all of medicine, not only in the specific case of cholera. By the final decades of the 19th century, the old belief in foul air as the primary source of epidemic disease had been almost entirely displaced within serious scientific circles, replaced by an understanding of invisible living organisms travelling through water, food and direct contact, a shift so fundamental that it's difficult from where we sit now to fully appreciate how disorienting it must have felt to physicians who had spent entire careers practicing medicine under the older framework, watching the foundational belief of their profession dissolve within the span of their own working lifetime. What this slow, halting transition ultimately reveals when considered as a whole is something quietly important about how human understanding actually advances, rarely through a single flash of insight, more often through decades of scattered, overlooked, sometimes rediscovered evidence accumulating gradually until the weight of it finally becomes impossible to ignore. Snow's careful map. Puccini's forgotten paper, Nightingale's misguided but effective reforms, Chadwick's well-intentioned sanitary campaigns, all of it, moving however unevenly toward the same eventual understanding, arriving from different directions through different methods, often without the people involved even being aware of how closely their work connected to one another's. And once that understanding finally did take hold, once the scientific world accepted fully and without serious dispute that invisible organisms carried through water were responsible for so much of the suffering, chronicled so far in this story, an entirely different question began to press itself forward with new and urgent clarity. If the danger could finally be seen, understood, and named, what exactly had it actually cost across all those centuries when no one could see it at all? And how many of those lost lives, counted quietly in small graves across every continent, might genuine understanding, arriving even a single generation earlier, have been able to save? The record that historians turn to most often when trying to grasp the true scale of what unsafe water cost humanity across the centuries is not a monument or a memorial. It is a stack of ordinary, almost bureaucratic documents that London's parish clerks began compiling every week, starting in the early 1600s, originally intended simply to track outbreaks of plague, but which ended up capturing something far larger and far more quietly devastating than anyone who started the practice could have anticipated. These weekly tallies, known as the Bills of Mortality, recorded the number of deaths in each London parish along with, whenever possible, a stated cause, and they survive today in remarkable unbroken sequence across more than 2 centuries. In the 1660s, a London merchant and amateur statistician named John Grant did something with these records that had never quite been done before. He sat down with the years of accumulated bills of mortality and began methodically to count, to compare, to look for patterns hiding inside numbers that everyone else had simply filed away and forgotten. What he found and published in a slim volume that historians now consider one of the founding texts of modern demography was staggering even by the standards of a century already accustomed to hardship. Grant calculated that roughly 1/3 of all children born in London during his lifetime died before reaching the age of 6, a figure so severe that it meant a typical family raising several children could reasonably expect to bury at least one, often more, before those children ever reached adulthood. Grant himself could not explain why, lacking any concept of bacteria or contamination, but his careful counting gave later generations something they had never possessed before, a precise, undeniable number attached to a suffering that had always been present but had never before been measured. What these records reveal, once historians began cross-referencing them against the seasonal patterns of London's water supply, is a rhythm that repeats with unsettling consistency across the centuries these documents span. Deaths among infants and young children did not distribute evenly throughout the year. They clustered again and again in the warmer months, precisely the season when bacteria multiply fastest in standing water, when wells run lower and more concentrated with contamination, and when spoiled food and drink became harder to avoid. Parish clerks recording these deaths a few centuries ago had no framework for understanding why late summer consistently proved so much deadlier for the very young than the depths of winter. The data simply sat there waiting a pattern hiding in plain sight for nearly 200 years before anyone possessed the scientific understanding necessary to explain it. There is a detail buried within this era of grief that tends to startle people the first time they encounter it, precisely because it reveals something about how differently pre-modern families related to loss that has become almost impossible for us to fully imagine today. Genealogists and historians studying parish baptismal and burial records across early modern Europe have documented repeatedly and across many different regions a practice that modern readers often find quietly devastating. When an infant died in early childhood, it was common for parents to give that same name to the next child of the same sex born into the family, a practice historians refer to as name recycling. A family might baptize 3, sometimes 4 children in succession, with the exact same name bearing each one in turn, before finally with the name attached to a child who survived watching it carry forward into adulthood. This was not, as it might first appear to modern eyes, evidence of families failing to grieve or treating children as interchangeable. Quite the opposite. Historians who have studied surviving letters and personal writing from this era describe it instead as an act of persistence, a family's determined effort to keep a chosen name and everything that name represented to them alive within their household, despite losses that arrived with a regularity almost impossible for us to imagine bearing today. It tells us something important and easy to overlook about how ordinary, how expected this particular kind of grief had become across nearly the entire span of human history before clean water existed. The scale of this loss becomes even more striking when placed against a number many people find genuinely surprising, a number that quietly reframes almost everything we think we understand about historical life expectancy. When we hear that average life expectancy in a given historical period was 35 years or 40 years, it is tempting to imagine a world where most adults simply died relatively young, worn out by hard labour and disease in their middle years. The reality, once you look closely at the underlying data, tells a considerably different, and in its own way more specific story. Historical life expectancy figures this low were driven overwhelmingly by extremely high mortality in the first 5 years of life, not by widespread early death among adults. A person who survived past the age of 5 in most pre-modern societies had a genuinely reasonable chance of living into their 60s or beyond, a fact that sits at odds with how popular imagination usually pictures the past. The devastating early figure was in large part an average distorted by an enormous cluster of infant and toddler deaths, dragging the overall number down. Deaths concentrated overwhelmingly in exactly the years when a child's body was most vulnerable to precisely the dangers this story has been tracing, contaminated water among the foremost of them. Historians studying this period do caution against drawing too clean or too simple a line directly from water. Quality to every one of these deaths, and it is worth being honest about that uncertainty here. The evidence remains incomplete in a crucial way, since so many historical death records list only vague or general causes, terms like fever flux or simply weakness, categories broad enough to encompass waterborne illness alongside malnutrition, respiratory disease, and a wide range of other pre-modern childhood dangers that often struck in combination rather than isolation. What demographic historians can say with real confidence based on the consistent seasonal clustering, the strong correlation between crowded, poorly drained urban neighborhoods and dramatically higher child mortality compared to nearby rural areas with better access to clean springs, and the sharp declines in child death that followed decades later. Once seas finally began separating drinking water from waste, is that unsafe water sat near the very centre of this pattern, one of the heaviest single threads woven through an enormously complicated tapestry of pre-modern childhood danger. Rural and urban comparisons from this era offer some of the clearest evidence available, and the contrast once you see it laid out is difficult to argue with. Detailed parish records surviving from 18th century England show infant mortality rates in London and other large crowded cities running consistently and substantially higher than in small rural villages. Only a short distance away, villages that shared the same climate, the same general standard of living, and largely the same medical knowledge or lack of it. The single most significant difference between these communities was density, and everything density brought with it. More people sharing fewer water sources, waste and drinking water pressed closer together, contamination with a shorter, more direct path from one household to the next. A child born into a small village with a clean, isolated spring genuinely had better odds of surviving early childhood than a child born into one of the wealthiest, most powerful cities on earth. A fact that would have struck most people of the period as almost impossible to believe, given how thoroughly city life was associated with progress, opportunity, and comfort. And perhaps this is the detail worth sitting with longest before this particular thread of the story moves forward. For the overwhelming majority of human history surviving to adulthood was never a certainty, or even in many places and many periods a genuine likelihood. It was something closer to a fragile, hard-won outcome, shaped as much by which well a family happened to draw, from which season a child happened to be weaned, in which neighbourhood a family happened to live within, as by anything resembling fate or fortune. Grief of this particular kind, quiet, expected, endlessly repeating across generation after generation, rarely appears in the grand narratives of kings, wars, and empires that usually dominate our sense of the past. It lived instead in parish registers, in small gravestones, bearing names recycled from an older sibling in the seasonal rhythm of a summer that families learned painfully to dread more than any other time of year. What finally began to interrupt this ancient, brutal pattern? What finally allowed a mother somewhere to stop counting the summers her children survived and start simply trusting the water flowing into her own home did not arrive through any single dramatic breakthrough, any single triumphant discovery announced to a waiting world. It arrived slowly through pipes laid one street at a time, through decades of unglamorous civic labour. Most people never think to celebrate. Through a transformation so gradual that many of the people living through its earliest stages never fully grasped what was actually changing beneath their own feet, or what it would eventually mean for a mother, standing for the very first time in her family's long history in front of a tap. As the woman standing at the sink is named Margaret Doyle, and the year is 1911, and the tenement building she lives in sits in one of the more crowded districts of New York's Lower East Side, home to families who arrived from across Europe within the last generation, crammed into apartments that until recently shared a single outdoor pump between as many as 20 households. Margaret turns a small brass handle above her kitchen basin, something she has done perhaps 100 times before in the weeks since the building's new plumbing was installed, and still every single time she pauses for a moment afterward, watching the water run clear and steady into the basin below, filling a pot for the evening meal, without a single trip down 4 flights of stairs, without a bucket, without the long wait behind neighbours doing the same. She had grown up in a village outside Naples where her mother walked nearly a mile each morning to a shared well, and some part of her even now still expects the water to stop, to hesitate to require the labour her whole life had taught her to associate with something this basic. It never does. It simply flows as though it had always flowed this easily, as though generations of women before her had not spent uncountable hours of their lives simply carrying it from one place to another. Margaret's small unremarkable moment at her kitchen sink represents the quiet ending point of a transformation that took the better part of a century to complete, built not through any single invention, but through an enormous, largely unglamorous accumulation of civic engineering, political will, and hard-won scientific understanding city by city, decade by decade. It is easy looking back from where we now stand to take running water for granted as simply how the world has always worked. It's worth remembering clearly and specifically just how recent this achievement actually is, and just how much labour, both physical and intellectual, it required. London, the same city that had watched Broad Street empty in terror decades earlier, provides one of the clearest and most dramatic examples of exactly what this transformation demanded. Even after Jon Snow's investigation, even after cholera had struck the city repeatedly across the 1840s and 50s, London's water and waste infrastructure remained largely unchanged, still relying heavily on the same aging network of cesspools and inadequate drainage that had helped spread the very outbreaks Snow had worked so hard to explain. What finally forced the issue remarkably was not another epidemic but a smell. During an unusually hot summer in 1858, the River Thames, by then serving as London's primary dumping ground for both industrial and human waste, produced an odour so overwhelming that it disrupted proceedings in the Houses of Parliament itself, located directly beside the river. Members of government forced to hold handkerchiefs soaked in chloride of lime against their faces, simply to continue their work, experienced directly and personally what much of London's poorer population had been enduring for years, and this event remembered in British history as the Great Stink, accomplished within a matter of weeks what decades of public health warnings and mounting death tolls had failed to achieve. Parliament rapidly approved funding for a comprehensive new sewer system for the entire city. The engineer given responsibility for this project, Joseph Basil Jett, would go on to design and oversee the construction of a network of enclosed underground brick sewers, stretching well over 1,000 miles beneath London, an engineering undertaking so vast and so carefully executed that significant portions of Basil Jett's original 19th century system remain in active use beneath London's streets today, still carrying wastewater safely away from the city more than 150 years after it was first built. Basil Jett, working from calculations of the city's likely future growth, deliberately designed the system's pipes considerably larger than contemporary population figures, strictly required a decision some of his contemporaries privately questioned as wasteful. His foresight would prove decades later to be one of the quiet triumphs of the entire project, since London's population growth in the following century would have overwhelmed a system built only to the standards of his own time. It is worth pausing on that detail for a moment because it reveals something genuinely admirable about the best of this era's civic engineering. Basil Jett was not simply solving the crisis in front of him. He was with real humility about how little certainty the future offered building for people he would never meet. Separating sewage from drinking water solved one enormous piece of the puzzle, but it did not on its own guarantee that the water reaching a household tap was actually safe to drink. And this next piece of the story unfolds not primarily in London, but across a series of quieter, less celebrated breakthroughs scattered across Europe and North America in the decades that followed. Filtration, the practice of passing water slowly through layers of sand and gravel to remove impurities, had existed in various forms for centuries, but it took on new scientific rigour once researchers understood that the goal was not merely clarity, but the removal of specific dangerous microorganisms invisible to the naked eye. The Scottish city of Paisley had actually pioneered a form of sand filtration for public water supply as early as 1832, well before germ theory existed to explain precisely why it worked, driven largely by simple, practical observation that filtered water seemed to produce less illness than unfiltered water. A conclusion reached through trial and careful attention rather than any formal scientific understanding of the mechanism involved. The breakthrough that would ultimately prove most consequential, however, involved not filtration but disinfection, and it arrived through a discovery made almost by accident in an American city few people today would immediately associate with a turning point in public health history. In 1908, the water utility serving Jersey City, New Jersey, faced an unusual and urgent problem. A legal dispute over water quality standards had left the utility needing to demonstrate quickly and reliably that its water supply met a specific bacteriological benchmark, and the engineer overseeing the system, a man named John Leal, made a decision that startled many of his contemporaries and, in the strictest legal sense, exceeded the authority explicitly granted to him. Without seeking prior approval from local health officials, uncertain whether they would grant it in time, Leal began adding small, carefully calculated amounts of chlorinated lime directly into the city's water supply, a substance already understood to kill bacteria, but never before applied at this scale to an entire municipal water system serving tens of thousands of people. Leal's gamble, and it genuinely was a gamble, given how little precedent existed for what he was attempting, worked. Bacterial counts in Jersey City's water dropped dramatically and remarkably. No serious harm to public health resulted from the treatment itself. Within a matter of years, chlorination spread rapidly to water systems across the United States, and eventually much of the industrialized world, becoming within a single generation one of the most significant public health interventions in human history, credited by many historians and epidemiologists with contributing more to the decline of infectious disease across the 20th century than almost any single medical treatment developed during the same period. There is a genuine irony worth noting here, one that connects backward across this entire story in a way that feels almost too fitting to be coincidental. Chlorine, the element finally deployed to make water safe on a mass municipal scale, functions in essentially the same basic way as the boiling process that had unknowingly protected those brewery workers on Broad Street more than half a century earlier, and in essentially the same way as the folk wisdom passed down by grandmothers across countless cultures who insisted, without ever being able to explain precisely why that water touched by fire was safer than water left untreated. The scientific solution that finally definitively ended centuries of quiet grinding loss was not in its underlying principle entirely new. It was in a sense the full scientific articulation of an instinct human beings had been reaching toward, imperfectly and without full understanding for thousands of years. The scale of what chlorination and filtration together ultimately accomplished, once fully implemented across major cities in the early decades of the 20th century, is difficult to overstate, and the historical data illustrating it remains genuinely striking even to researchers who study public health for a living. In American cities that adopted water filtration and chlorination in the early 1900s, overall mortality rates dropped substantially within the following years, and typhoid deaths specifically, one of the clearest and most direct markers of waterborne illness, declined by roughly half within a single decade in many of the cities that implemented these treatments earliest. Some economic historians studying this period have gone further still, arguing, through careful statistical analysis, comparing cities that adopted clean water technology at different times, that filtration and chlorination together may be responsible for a substantial share, by some estimates close to half of the overall decline in mortality experienced by American cities during the first decades of the 20th century, a claim significant enough that it places clean water among the most consequential public health achievements in the entire history of medicine, standing alongside vaccination and modern sanitation as one of the true pillars of the dramatic increase in human life expectancy achieved over the past century and a half. This transformation did not arrive everywhere at once, and it is worth being honest about the uneven pace of its spread, since the historical record here resists any simple, tidy narrative of steady global progress. Wealthy cities in industrialized nations gained access to filtered, chlorinated water considerably earlier than poorer urban areas within those same countries, and considerably earlier still than most of the rest of the world. Scholars studying the global history of water infrastructure still debate exactly how to weigh the many overlapping factors: colonial history, economic development, political priority, geography, that determined which populations gained access to safe water first and which were left waiting in some cases for the better part of another century. What is not disputed is that this single unglamorous technological shift, clean water flowing reliably from a tap, reshaped the basic experience of childhood, motherhood, and daily survival for an enormous share of humanity within the span of just a few generations, transforming an experience that had remained essentially unchanged since the earliest river civilizations into something that for the first time in human history, a family could simply trust without a second thought. Margaret Doyle, standing at her kitchen sink in 1911, likely never thought of herself as living through a historic turning point. She was simply filling a pot for dinner, grateful in the quiet, unremarkable way people are grateful for conveniences that quickly come to feel ordinary, that she no longer needed to walk 4 flights of stairs and stand in line behind her neighbours for something as basic as water for her family's meal. She could not have known, standing there, how recently this trust had become possible, how many centuries of walking, waiting, worrying, and burying small children had come before this particular unremarkable moment finally arrived. Perhaps that is worth sitting with for a moment. How many of the small, unnoticed comforts we now move through every day without a second thought were once the product of exactly this kind of long, difficult, largely invisible struggle? And yet even as cities like New York and London completed this remarkable transformation, even as chlorination and filtration spread steadily across the industrialized world, through the early decades of the 20th century, this same quiet, ancient danger had not vanished from the earth entirely. It had simply retreated unevenly to places the new infrastructure had not yet reached, waiting patiently in villages, in refugee camps, in regions where the same basic engineering achievement that had transformed Margaret Doyle's kitchen sink remained even now, decades later, still frustratingly, tragically out of reach. And in a small village in the highlands of Ethiopia, not far from the modern city of Lalibela, a 9-year-old girl named Salam wakes most mornings before the sun has fully cleared the ridge above her family's home. And the first task of her day before school, before breakfast, is the same task her mother performed at her age, and her grandmother before that, walking a winding path down toward a spring nearly 2 miles from her house, carrying an empty yellow plastic container that once held cooking oil, now repurposed as so many are across this region into the vessel that will bring her family's water home. The walk down takes perhaps 40 minutes. The walk back with the container full and heavy against her back takes considerably longer, and it is not uncommon, her mother says, for Selim to arrive at school not merely tired but late, her uniform sometimes still damp from water that sloshed and spilled along the uneven trail. What makes Salam's story worth sitting with is not that it is extraordinary. It is that across enormous stretches of the world today, in the second decade of the 21st century, it remains almost entirely ordinary, a daily reality shared by millions of children, whose lives in this one specific and fundamental respect resemble the lives of children living centuries, even millennia, before them considerably more closely than they resemble the lives of children living only a few hundred miles away in a nearby city. It is worth pausing here gently to notice something that easily slips past us. This is not a story confined entirely to the past. Some part of it is still happening quietly right now while most of the world sleeps. Selim's village does have a well of sorts, though its story is its own small specific history worth understanding. A borehole was drilled there some years earlier, sunk considerably deeper into the ground than any hand-dug well the village had previously relied on, fitted with a mechanical hand pump designed to draw water up from an aquifer far below the reach of surface contamination. For a period of roughly 3 years, this pump served the village reliably, and Selim's mother remembers those years with a particular specific fondness, remembers not needing to walk to the spring at all, remembers the pump handle's distinctive squeak as neighbours took their turns filling containers only a short distance from their own front doors. Then one dry season, the pump's mechanism failed a worn seal inside the cylinder, finally giving out after years of daily use, and the village found itself facing a problem that turns out to be remarkably common across similar communities throughout the region, a problem that rarely appears in the initial celebrations that accompany a new well's construction. The specific spare part required to repair the pump was not available anywhere within a reasonable distance, and no one in the village possessed the particular technical knowledge needed to source or install it correctly. This detail, once you learn it, tends to reshape how you think about the entire subject of water access in the world today, because it runs against the instinct many people have when first encountering this issue. It is tempting to imagine the challenge as primarily one of construction, of simply drilling enough wells, building enough pumps, and considering the problem solved. The reality on the ground across many regions tells a more complicated story. Researchers studying rural water infrastructure across parts of Africa have found that substantial proportions of hand pumps installed over past decades, by some estimates as many as 1 in 3 at any given time, sit broken or non-functional. Not because the original engineering was flawed, but because the ongoing maintenance, spare parts, and technical training required to keep a mechanical pump running for years or decades were never adequately built into the systems that installed them in the first place. A well, it turns out, is not simply a single achievement completed once. It is closer to a promise that must be renewed continually year after year in ways that are far less visible and far less easy to celebrate than the day the pump first began to flow. For Selim's village, this meant returning after those 3 years of relative ease to the spring. Their grandparents had always used the same walking path, the same uneven ground, the same daily labour that had shaped the lives of women and children in this particular valley for as long as anyone could remember. There is something quietly striking in that return, a reminder that progress in this particular story has rarely moved in a single steady upward line. It moves instead in fits and starts forward for a while, then backward, then forward, again, shaped by funding, by maintenance, by geography, by decisions made in distant offices that a 9-year-old girl carrying water down a mountain path will never see or hear about, yet will feel in her own body, in her own tired legs every single morning. The spring itself, the one Selim and her mother rely on, now carries its own quiet uncertainty, one that speaks to a broader and genuinely unresolved question researchers are still working through. The spring water looks clear. It tastes by every account from those who drink it daily clean and pleasant, much like the beloved pump on Broad Street once did. Whether it is truly free of the bacteria and parasites capable of causing serious illness is not something the village itself has any reliable way of testing, and periodic water quality surveys conducted in similar rural springs across the region have found wildly inconsistent results. Some springs testing clean, others appearing identical to the eye, carrying contamination levels considered unsafe by international health standards. Scholars and public health researchers studying this specific challenge still debate the best way to reach and monitor these scattered remote water sources consistently, given how many thousands of similar springs exist across similarly remote terrain, each one requiring its own testing, its own attention, its own maintenance, spread across landscapes where transportation itself can take hours or days. The uncertainty here is not a failure of effort. It is simply the genuine, unresolved shape of a very old problem meeting a very large and complicated modern world. And yet threaded through this story there is something that deserves real attention alongside its hardship, because it would be a disservice to Selim and to millions like her to tell this part of the story as though it consisted only of loss. Guinea worm disease. The ancient affliction described earlier in this same story, the one possibly connected to the origins of medicine's serpent and staff symbol, the one that had tormented villages across Africa and Asia for thousands of years, has been brought through decades of patient, unglamorous effort involving exactly this kind of village by village, water, education filtering and monitoring, to the very edge of complete eradication. In the 1980s, an estimated 3.5 million cases occurred worldwide each year. By the most recent counts available, that number has fallen to only a small handful of cases annually, a reduction of more than 99%, achieved almost entirely without vaccines or medication, through nothing more sophisticated than teaching communities to filter their drinking water and identifying and treating infected individuals before they could contaminate a water source again. It stands as one of the quietest, least celebrated public health triumphs in modern history, a disease with roots reaching back to ancient Egyptian medical papyri, now standing on the threshold of becoming only the second human disease ever fully eradicated from the earth after smallpox, a genuinely remarkable achievement that receives by any fair measure far less recognition than it deserves. Selam does not know this history, and there is no particular reason she should. She knows her own path down to the spring, the particular tree she rests beneath, part way through the walk, the specific weight of a full container against her back, the specific relief of setting it down at her own doorstep. She knows that some mornings when the rains have been generous, the walk feels easier. The spring runs fuller, and other mornings in the driest parts of the year, the walk takes longer. The spring runs lower, and she and her mother must sometimes make the trip twice within the same day. She is in this specific and very physical sense living inside the same fundamental relationship with water that Elena once lived inside, standing at her own well many centuries earlier, the same daily uncertainty, the same quiet, necessary trust, placed in a source she cannot fully verify, the same labour absorbed so completely into ordinary life that it rarely feels from the inside like hardship at all. It simply feels like Tuesday and then Wednesday and then the long familiar rhythm of every day that follows. What connects Salam's morning walk to Eleanor's well, to Margaret Doyle's kitchen sink, to the crowded, doomed streets of Soho is not tragedy for its own sake, and it would be a mistake to leave her story there framed only as suffering to be pitied from a comfortable distance. What connects all of these lives across so many centuries and so many different corners of the world is something closer to a single quiet continuous thread running through the whole of human history, the simple, essential fact that access to safe water is always determined more directly and more completely than almost anything else who lives, who suffers, and who simply gets to move through an ordinary day without having to think even once about whether the cup in their hand might carry something that could take everything from them. That thread stretching from the earliest river civilizations all the way to a 9-year-old girl walking home this very morning with a yellow container balanced against her back is very nearly ready to bring this long story to its close, though not before pausing one final time to consider what all of it taken together might actually mean. There's a museum in London today tucked into a quiet corner of the city that holds among its many artefacts something almost embarrassingly small and unremarkable to look at. A pump handle, cast iron roughly the length of a forearm, worn smooth in places by hands that gripped it thousands of times before anyone in Soho ever understood what it had been doing to them. It sits behind glass now, unassuming, easy to walk past without a second glance, and yet it represents, perhaps as completely as any single object could, the entire arc of the story this night has traced. A village well in the 14th century. A mother named Elena lowering a bucket, telling herself the water would be fine because it had always been fine before. A civilization along the Nile prospering and suffering from the same river in the same breath. A city in Mesopotamia writing laws about clean water into its earliest legal codes. An engineering marvel in ancient Persia, carrying water through darkness for 3,000 years without a single moving part. A metropolis in the shadow of a lake in the valley of Mexico, its dual aqueducts astonishing conquerors who had never seen anything like it at home. A capital city that once delivered more water per person than many modern cities manage today, and then astonishingly forgot how. A brewery full of workers who survived only because beer requires boiling. A widow who died for the taste of a well she had left behind years earlier. A physician who mapped the dead one by one and was not believed until after he was gone. An Italian anatomist who saw the truth under a microscope and was ignored for nearly 30 years. A nurse who saved thousands of lives while believing sincerely and wrongly in the reason why. An engineer who built sewers oversized enough to serve a city that would not exist for 100 years. A man in New Jersey who broke the rules to put chlorine in the water, and in doing so quietly saved more lives than almost anyone else in the history of the medicine. A mother at a kitchen sink in New York watching water flow and half expecting it to stop. A girl in the highlands of Ethiopia walking the same path her grandmother walked this very morning while most of the world was still asleep. What connects all of it when you finally step back far enough to see the whole shape of the thing is not really water at all. It is trust. It is the particular universal, quietly terrifying act of putting something into your own body or your own child's body without being able to see what is truly inside it. Every civilization in this story, however sophisticated, however advanced, however confident in its own understanding of the world, was ultimately doing the same thing Elena did at her well. Extending a kind of faith towards something it could not verify because the alternative thirst was worse and more immediate and left no room for hesitation. And history, when you look at it closely enough, keeps circling back to a particular kind of humility about power. The most powerful empire in the ancient world built an aqueduct system that delivered water more efficiently than most modern cities, and then lost it within a few generations. Not through any dramatic defeat, but through simple neglect, through the slow invisible failure to maintain what had once seemed permanent. Tenochtitlan built one of the most sophisticated water systems on Earth, and it was dismantled deliberately, stone by stone within a matter of years by people who did not value what they were destroying because they did not understand it. Even Jersey City's triumph, the chlorine that would eventually save millions of lives worldwide, began as an act of quiet defiance by one engineer, uncertain whether his superiors would ever approve it in time. Power, expertise, empire, none of it on its own, has ever been enough to guarantee that clean water reaches a child's cup. It has always required something more fragile than power. It has required continuous, unglamorous, unremembered maintenance performed by people whose names rarely survive in any record at all. And beside every empire, every collapse, every triumph of engineering, there is the other pattern quieter and in its own way sturdier. Ordinary people finding ways to survive anyway. Grandmothers passing down rules about which wells to trust built on nothing but generations of careful watching. Families choosing the same name for a second, a third, a fourth child, refusing to let loss erase what a name was meant to carry forward. A village that lost its pump and simply returned, without complaint, to the path their own grandparents had worn into the hillside decades earlier. There is something in this pattern worth sitting with gently before this story closes. Something about the particular kind of endurance that does not announce itself, does not ask to be remembered, and yet carried an entire species forward across thousands of years of uncertainty that would have broken anything less patient. The evidence sits quietly in places most of us will never think to look. In 3,000-year-old tissue still carrying the trace of a parasite ancient physicians described but could not name. In a museum case in London around a small piece of cast iron. In parish registers where a name appears 3 times in a row, each time beside a different date. In statistics showing guinea worm disease once striking millions each year now nearly gone from the earth entirely, not through any miracle but through decades of unglamorous patient work that almost no one outside the field will ever hear celebrated. Each of these fragments taken alone is small. Taken together, they form something close to the truest portrait we have of what it actually meant to be human across most of recorded history, dependent, vulnerable, and remarkably stubbornly persistent anyway. It is worth remembering gently as this night draws toward its own quiet close, how recent our own safety truly is. Somewhere between Margaret Doyle's kitchen sink and this exact moment, an entire species crossed a threshold it had been reaching toward for thousands of years, largely without noticing the crossing itself. Most of us alive today will never stand at a well the way Elena once did, wondering without saying it aloud whether the water in front of us might carry something that could take everything, that not knowing that particular fear has quietly disappeared from the daily experience of an enormous share of humanity so completely that it no longer even registers as an absence. We simply turn a handle and water comes, and we think of almost anything else while it fills the cup. Let the pace slow now. Think of the well again. Just the well. Stone worn smooth by hands that came before yours. Think of the rope lowering and the quiet sound it makes. Think of every mother who ever stood exactly where you might have stood, not knowing and choosing to trust anyway because there was no other way to live. Think of the water itself moving the way it has always moved through rock, through soil, through the dark spaces beneath every village that ever existed, indifferent to all of it, the empires and the collapses. The physicians believed too late, the children remembered only in the names given to the siblings who came after them. The water does not remember any of this. It never did. It simply moves the way it always has, the way it always will. Patient, indifferent, essential, flowing tonight through pipes beneath cities that Elena could never have imagined, and through the same tired, familiar path down a hillside in Ethiopia that her own life would have recognized instantly. Somewhere right now a tap is turning, water is filling a cup, and somewhere else, just as real, a girl is walking home in the dark, a container balanced against her back, the sound of her footsteps the only sound for miles. Both of these are still true. Both of these are still happening. The well is still there if you know where to look. The water is still flowing quietly beneath everything.